we begin in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson.
Ferguson police just killed a man in front of my apartment. He had his arms in the air, and they shot him 10 times.
That's my son.
I'm so sorry.
Laying in the street for hours.
We gonna let them know enough is enough.
Congratulations. Keep it up. Clap one more time for these guys. Come on.
Thank you.
This is a film that is a couple years in the making, right? The two of you, I believe, met while making the film, while sort of collecting footage. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I went to St. Louis. I was living here in New York. I went to St. Louis about a month after Mike Brown was killed. And my DP and I, who was a friend from college, we went out there, kind of organically started recording, trying to figure out how to document the story, and we really wanted to collaborate with someone who was from there. So we asked around. A lot of people brought Damon's name up, very well-respected visual artist and musician in the St. Louis community, and about 3 months later, we got hooked up.
Yeah, that's about it. That's the size of it.
And what were you doing at the time in St. Louis? Were you collecting your own footage? Were you out shooting stuff?
Actually, I wasn't. Actually, I got pulled into doing more protests and eventually, like, helping to organize events and different things. So I kind of became an organizer on the spot, just through cultural means. Like Sabaah said, I was doing art, music, and so I just used all of those skills that I've been, I guess, acquiring my whole life. And I was the guy in the room that could draw, so I was drawing the flyers and the posters, and I was the one that knew the club owners, so I would help find spots for people to strategize or to have events and things of that nature, and it just started to snowball. And so for the most part, I was in the mix, doing things, and then later on, like they were just everywhere recording. Her and Lucas, who is now our cinematographer, we just kept missing each other. And then one day I did an art show. There was a retrospective about the first 2 weeks, and they came, we met, we hit it off, and we've been rolling ever since.
Damon, what did that, you used the word snowball. What did that snowball feel like at the time?
I may need like a couple of months or years to really, dissect the real feeling of it. It just felt like everything was happening at once. And it wasn't much time to really sit down and process what was going on. It was just like all hands on deck. If you do something, if you down and get down and help where you can. And that's kind of what I mean. It was like things escalated very quickly for me personally. And before I knew it, I was just, every day I quit my job. I was just in it every day.
Yeah. Quit your job, and it was all hands on deck to get out there and get the message across.
Yeah, with a message, but being a part of the community of protest that was there. I knew at some point that the message would have to be put out there correctly, because the messages in the media and the narrative was not from the point of view of the protesters or the community. And that's one of the main things that brought Sabaah and I together, because I wanted to do it. I did, but I was moving, so I didn't have the footage. They did, but we wanted to, we ended up doing it together because we had the same political analysis and we had the same idea what was going to go on. So we partnered up and made it happen.
Now, Sabaah, I would imagine that was part of the manifesto for the film going into editing it, or at least while you were shooting it as well, that it was going to be the story of the people telling their own story rather than going to others who were trying to sort of co-opt that narrative or reshape that narrative for a sort of much more easily digestible, culturally digestible, or culturally, specifically for a white culture, digestible for them. I would imagine that was your main manifesto for how you went about making the film. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt like when I was watching the news, what was being depicted about Ferguson, it really lacked humanity. There didn't seem to be much interest on behalf of mainstream media outlets in, helping us understand what are the long-standing tensions here, what are people going through, what are they thinking and feeling. What I saw was a mediascape that was really accepting the official point of view and not questioning anything about what police officials were putting forward.
And looking for footage of riots. I mean, that's generally what I remember of like mainstream news. I hate that phrase now, but the sort of the cable news outlets that people would tune into is that you would have a reporter standing on the street, essentially looking like they were waiting for a riot to happen and acting as if a riot was going to break out no matter what, because it was good for ratings, it was good for TV. Never were they interviewing the people, like you said.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We came up with the term riot porn because they would just play the same clips on loop over and over and over. And we didn't want to shy away from what had happened in the film, but we just wanted to look at that energy and that explosion as something that is, a consequence of larger forces and a consequence of really long-standing tension.
Let's talk about those larger forces. What were those larger forces that were happening in Ferguson prior to the death of Michael Brown?
So just so we clear, Ferguson is a suburb of St. Louis, right? So one thing that the media was really good at doing was isolating Ferguson, as though it was a one-off thing. There was nothing else going on. But the St. Louis area has a long-standing, I guess, racial tension that goes back centuries. Like that, we address it in the very beginning of the movie when we talking about the Dred Scott case that happened in St. Louis. A lot of different things. And different factors go into the way people are treated there, like the way people are policed in the municipalities, the way that whole municipalities are funded off of like traffic tickets and things of that nature. How the police accountability is low, if any, because of the way prosecutor, circuit attorney, like everybody works together to keep this systematic oppression going and to like basically feed off of poor black people. And that's a cultural thing that happens not only in Ferguson, but all across the metropolitan area. You know what I mean? And
you have a predominantly white police force as well, correct?
Yeah. And also, just St. Louis in general is super segregated. Like even in the city, there's a street called Delmar, and it's like internationally known as the Delmar Divide. It literally splits the city by race, educational background, socioeconomic status, but like the entire city is pocketed off. That goes back to like white flight in the 50s and 60s, you know what I mean? But it's a long-standing situation, and I think it's because, like in the South, during the Civil Rights Movement, the South had to deal with their problems because of cameras being on them, and like the Midwest, there's still strongholds of real deal racism, and I think St. Louis is one of them. But I hope after this, things move forward a little bit,
Does it feel like things are moving forward in St. Louis at all since this?
I think it's a slow crawl, you know what I mean? But I think certain things have happened. More than anything, I'm very happy about the people taking on the idea of divesting from this system instead of waiting for it to save them or waiting for it to come around and see them as people. And that's something that I really saw happen after Ferguson. People are radicalized to a degree that I haven't seen in my generation. So that's one positive thing, and I like to focus on the people anyway instead of waiting on, the other side to pick it up and figure it out.
So you're collecting footage with your DP, you meet Damon. When did you guys decide that you had enough footage to go and start editing? Were you editing while you were shooting? What was the process like for you?
Our editor, Chris McNabb, was really terrific, and he kind of was taking our footage and processing it as we went. But we actually opened the edit in earnest in January of 2016, and we continued to shoot until April of that same year. So there was definitely some overlap in terms of editing and continuing to gather footage. The edit was really a push. We really felt like it was important to get the film out this year, to get it into the conversation as soon as possible. I don't know of many other examples where filmmakers have been able to capture the birth of a movement like that and, put out what that message is while it's still relevant, while it's still happening.
One of the criticisms, and I think it's a BS criticism that I've seen of the film, is that it doesn't show other perspectives and that it stays within the perspective of the movement itself. How do you respond to that? I think it's garbage criticism, to be honest with you. We have enough other perspectives, but how did you feel about that when you started seeing that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think the underlying kind of statement is that both sides are not shown unless there's somehow an apology for, killing this unarmed teenager, unless there's somehow an apology or something that explains away what's happening. People don't consider both sides to be shown. But the reality is, you hear from the president, you hear from the governor, you hear from, the highway patrol officer, you see the police officers, you see what they do, you see, the woman on the highway, how she feels, you read her words later.
You mostly hear from authority.
Right. You do hear from authority, and we made a point to bring those authority figures in throughout the film so that you could see what was going on the other side, what people were reacting to. And I think what people want is really in a way to empathize with those who are, participating in this repression. And that's not something that we necessarily did as filmmakers. We interviewed the mayor, we interviewed the chief of police, we interviewed the city manager, and none of them really broke from those talking points. And we felt like you had seen those on the news. They had every platform to share those talking points. We were really interested in the human stories.
And in developing the human stories, when you were editing the film, did you ever have a hard time shaping the narrative by just focusing on a sort of verite, being embedded with a sort of verite narrative? That's a very hard way to shape a story.
Yeah, it definitely was challenging. We started with a 90-minute cut that had none of the social media footage that you see, none of the protest footage, none of the press conferences. It was just intimate character stories. And from there, we kind of built it up to this 3-hour-long collage of all these different sources and then kind of stripped away.
Back down.
Right. So it was definitely an extremely challenging process, and I just have to commend, again, my editor, our story consultant, Carol Dysinger, who came in toward the end and really helped us to, identify some of the problems we were having with the film and bring it home. But towards the end, it really was kind of a math problem of story design and all these different threads that we had and figuring out how to connect them.
It's fascinating that you didn't know while you were shooting it that it was going to be this kind of like embedded perspective, and you tried to get the sort of broader reach, but they stuck to these talking points. Did you realize when you were interviewing them then that you were probably going to have to cut them out, or did you kind of get into the editing room and were like, this doesn't really help shape what we're trying to say?
I think it was pretty early in the edit that we realized they weren't going to be super useful. It was just that the tone was so much different. Everything we had with the people on the ground was so visceral and so, lively. And then you had these kind of sterile, dry intellectual interviews, and it just didn't really seem to have a place.
I agree with that. We knew pretty early that and also another thing is like you can clearly see by people's actions what side they're on. So I really think that we gave an accurate portrayal of what was going on. You know what I mean? Like you can see how the police feel by the way they act inside of the film. You can see how what the governor was thinking by the way he acts. And those sit down interviews again. The talking head thing was not the vibe we were going for anyway. So I think we made the right choice.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It adds a kind of radicalism to the aesthetic of the documentary rather than sort of just being your standard run-of-the-mill documentary that's just trying to cover a historical moment and sort of move on. I'm curious what you think about this. Obviously, we talked about how cable news covers this, which is like these are news operations that are for the most part run by white people, generally white men for the most part. And I'm sure there were a lot of white filmmakers down in Ferguson at the time trying to make their documentaries or gathering footage for their documentaries, and they're probably going to come out at some point if they haven't already. I can't think of one off the top of my head. How important is it, though, for you as Black filmmakers to be telling this story? Do you find that to be more important than white filmmakers telling the story?
I think that white filmmakers have always had the opportunity to tell every story. So from a filmmaking perspective, I do think that it's definitely time for us as Black filmmakers to be allowed to have authorship over situations like these, but I think also in other circumstances. I think that being a Black person in this country, it's not just that you have to understand your own community. It's not just that we have some kind of special insight into what it's like just to be a Black person. In order to survive, we really have to be able to look at this society and figure out what are people thinking, what do they see, why are they behaving the way that they behave. And for survival, because we so often find ourselves in a vulnerable situation where if it's my word against yours, it's going to be your word. So I have to be constantly figuring out how to maneuver in this world. And I think it does make for some really powerful storytelling. I think you see it in literature. I think you see it in music. And I think that as the gatekeepers kind of are willing to take risks on authors like us, you'll start to see it more and more in film as well.
Yeah, and even to take it a step further, the idea of intersectionality and being very, very specific with who's telling the story. Like a Black woman being involved and telling the story of Black women, somebody that lives in the place that we're talking about, being able to speak for their own community. And I think that is just as important as like us being Black, but like these specific Black people, because we get caught up in this idea that all Black people think the same way, and white people don't have that predisposition when it's time for them to tell their story. So I think that we were the right people to tell this particular story the way it was told in this film.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with everything you said anymore. One of the things that I love about the film is that while you have characters, the focus is on the movement as a whole. And so often when we make movies, be they documentaries or fiction films that are about movements, it ends up being a sort of individualistic hero that rises to the top at the end of the film. And it's such a false narrative for what is actually necessary for movements in this country, which is that the people come together as a collective and they work together. How important was it for you? Because it is definitely a big part of the film. How important was it for you, especially you, Damon, being such a big part of the movement, to sort of make sure that came across at the end of the day with the film? Yeah,
from the very beginning, that was one of our goals, to show the communal aspect of what it took to make this thing happen, and show that it's an ecosystem of people that make a movement happen, and it's not one iconic leader. You know what I mean? And as history goes past, as history and time passes, we tend to deify people, and we had an opportunity here to be right there with the camera, the way there wasn't anybody next to Dr. King, so we got to show some of the things like the humanity in people. And so by showing that, if when one person is weak, the other person is strong. And you know what I mean? Like a community has to come together to make something like this run. And from the very beginning, we wanted to do that. In the very beginning, it was a much bigger idea, and we had to be realistic about the fact that we, you can't tell every single story. But I think we did a very good job of showing how communal and how large of an operation it was for this to actually happen,
And how difficult was that for you as a filmmaker? Because as a storyteller, I think we're told very early on that it's about a hero, it's a hero's journey, or it's a couple heroes, but that you have to focus on this community so that you can do it justice. Was it difficult for you to sort of thread all of those or strand all those threads together?
Yeah, it was definitely difficult. We spent a lot of late nights in the edit room trying to figure out just how to make this work. And I think at the end of the day, it was about identifying cause and effect. What are the kind of public causes of these really intimate effects, and trying to figure out how do we portray the relationship between the public and private For me personally, as a filmmaker, it's something I'm really fascinated by because I think so often we have these either-or situations where, the life that we have outside in the street or in the world or professionally seems so different from what goes on in our homes. And part of the argument that we wanted this film to put forward is that all of it matters. What matters, what happens at your dinner table is just as important as whatever you go out and do politically, whether that be protesting, voting, whatever the case may be.
Absolutely, and you find an amazing character to showcase that as well in this film. Let's open it up to questions. Who has a question out here? Right here.
Hi. Thanks for being here. I was wondering if you found it difficult to select an ending for this film, considering that a lot of these issues are sort of open-ended and ongoing, and the Black Lives Matter movement is still doing a lot of work currently.
We knew what the ending was when it happened. When we were at, that was the anniversary of the 9 indictment, the 1-year anniversary, when it was just magical. Like, we saw, the chant happened at the end, and Kenna came up, and, right after it was over in the car, we was like, that's the end, so let's fill in the blanks, you know what I mean? Like, the ending was probably the least stressful part of the process for me personally, because when it happened, it was like magic,
Next question.
Hi. Since the ending was the least stressful part, what was the most stressful part? Just everything, or?
Probably just the actual experience of making it and being in production. I remember feeling a bit relieved when we were done filming because we all have real relationships with everyone that you see in the film. And so sometimes it was hard to kind of ask people to relive experiences that they went through there and, reshare them on screen, or pushing people to let us be in their private space after, all the protesting and everything has died down. It's kind of like, what are we still doing here? So there were a lot of really emotional moments out there with the camera and with people that were, very challenging.
I want to go back, just because it's just popped in my head, to something that we were talking about earlier, which is black filmmakers telling this story versus white filmmakers telling this story, and how important it is, I think, that you told the story because you're telling your story versus explaining your story through the lens of white people. Because so often everything is made for one group versus if they're the ones making it or if they're the ones who need to understand it. That even when black entertainment is made, it's this idea that well, white people get it, and I'm wondering what you were thinking about when you were making the film, or were you just like, no, we're going to tell our story as organically and as honestly as we can, and who cares about that group and whether we don't need to explain ourselves to them.
Yeah, that's pretty much been it. That's pretty much been it. It's been people trying to
Good
pull
for you.
us. It's been people trying to pull us in different directions. But we kept it very, very close to the heart and made sure that every step was made to tell a story to black people, for black people. And so that black people would see the greatness and the majesty in themselves and make a mirror for black people. And a lot of other art forms have done that throughout time and space, and white people get it eventually, you know what I'm saying? That's what all of this music is that everybody's dancing to, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't necessarily made for them, but they'll figure it out. And that was just a big thing for us, throughout the process, Answer?
Yeah, I felt pretty sure that if we could make something that rang true to the people who experienced this, then it would have truth for anyone, whether they, were inside of the community or outside. At the end of the day, we are all human beings. We do all, value. We want the best for our families, for ourselves. We want safety, we want security. And so it's possible to tell a human story about black people without catering to what a white audience needs and, for them to still understand it. I think, the real joy of watching a film is the distance that you have to travel to meet that experience and put yourself in the shoes of the main characters and the protagonists. And I would never want to deprive any audience of the opportunity to actually do that work.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question right here.
Hi. So I know, with the recent protests, there have been, Black Lives Matter has joined with other groups like Women's March and the immigration ban. And do you feel like that helps or dilutes some of the history or the cause, forgetting what happened?
No, I think solidarity is extremely important. I think that You know, I like the phrase all Black lives matter, meaning there are Black folks who are dealing with deportation, there are Black folks who are women who are dealing with all the issues that we face. I think it's really important for us to be in solidarity with one another. And if we can do it in a way that doesn't, that kind of resists this urge to erase Black people into this kind of colorblind rhetoric where it's everybody, if we can do it in a way where we're still able to center Blackness and acknowledge that Black people, you know, are kind of marginalized in all these different ways and are able to lead in all these different ways. I think that solidarity is a beautiful thing, yeah.
I had a beautiful moment at a protest this past year where it was a protest for one thing, and then in the middle of it, it opened up for this other march that was coming down the street, I think, for climate change, and forgot, well, we were protesting the ban, the travel ban, and then all of a sudden it was like, open it up for our climate friends, and it just became this really big moment of solidarity that was really kind of beautiful. Like, we're all in this together, you know, which was really nice. Guys, I love the film. Congratulations. It's an incredible achievement. How can people see it? When can people get their eyes on it?
It'll be in theaters nationwide starting August 11th. Please check it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys. Who's Streets? Thank you.